Hello and welcome to this high-level overview where we will be going over some of the key processes for scoping a project in Salesforce.com. Now, while this PowerPoint is focused on Salesforce, these processes can be used for any other CRM projects that you might be scoping out. So I like to focus on trying to keep these within 10 minutes to get you the information you need. It's not very in-depth, as I said, it's very high level, just 9 areas that we're going to dive into, and a few added notes at the end. So let's begin by taking a look at our agenda. I always like to start off with a question here. What type of information is needed to scope a project? Well, there's some key buckets that they need to be understood before we go into this project to scope it, right? We have these 9 areas I'd like to dive into. We have organizational complexities, number 1, business process, followed by Salesforce.com configurations, customizations, mobile, collaboration, data migration, integrations, and last but not least, user adoption and training. So let's start off with number 1, organizational complexity. Well, first off, you need to start by identifying the number of users and user groups who will be using the application. Are the users located in multiple regions or countries? What is the hierarchy of the organization? These are some of the key factors in understanding how complex an implementation can be. Number 2 is business process, identifying the business process that are in scope for the project. This may include things like account management, opportunity management, call center chat, or other custom processes that would lead to a custom application. And a great way to understand the full scope is to walk through each of these business processes with a prospect. And I always recommend going into the room with a client and with 2 people, one to take notes in Google Docs, the other to have a whiteboard and whiteboard out these processes so you have a visual aspect to this whole description. So you can go into detail and you don't have to break up that conversation to take notes. You have that person taking notes and you can get together and finish off those things later. But it's really important to have a couple people in on those conversations. Or if you have the time and the client says, okay, grab a camera and tape record the whole session and you can go back to it later. Another thing is what are the requirements that come out of those processes, and how complex are those processes? As we discussed before in the previous video, are you building a kayak or an aircraft carrier? So a lot of different processes for a lot of different people and businesses. And will they be met with standard configurations or require customizations? Or as I like to say, configure or code. Which brings us to our configuration slide, number 3. These are all of the declarative functions within Salesforce, including but not limited to fields, page layouts, record types, workflow rules, and approvals. And keep in mind that declarative, when I say declarative, I am referring to anything that can be configured within Salesforce without code. Now, second, the configurations in scope should be directly related to the business processes that are in scope. For example, if opportunity management is in scope, then we are likely to be configuring opportunities, products, price books, which we've gone over in the previous video on the overview of the sales process lifecycle, and forecasting. And that brings us to number 4, customizations. This includes all requirements that cannot be met with declarative configurations within Salesforce. So you need to identify the parts of the process that will require custom codes such as triggers, visual force pages, and Apex code. And keep in mind the third little bullet there is very important. Whenever you do customizations, there is maintenance required. When Salesforce does an upgrade, a lot of times you have to have the support systems in place to configure or reconfigure some of these code customizations so that they can keep up with the upgrades in Salesforce. There's going to be additional support, and that means there is going to be additional cost, which you should discuss with your customer. And now we're in number 5, mobile. Identify requirements to use a mobile device. You should probably have some case studies ready. For example, tablets, if they have text in the field, they're going to require tablets who would like to see how an iPad would be used for people in the field. Be ready to discuss these processes and also for smartphones, for salespeople in the field. So make sure you have some great case studies available. And will the standard Salesforce mobile app meet the requirements, or do we need to build a custom application? If you are building a custom application or think there's a need for that, you should probably have a third party ready to build it, or at least have someone in mind to be able to fill in the gaps for information that you need to provide the customer. Number 6, collaboration. The discussion of chatter, content, collaboration, social needs should come up early and often. When I say early, it should be coming from the Salesforce account executive, followed by the sales engagement team and the account. You want to be identifying a sample use case or two, like, for example, from sales, marketing, or support processes. These tend to be the initial targets for these discussions, and this will help vet out the collaborative intents early. So will they collaborate on account, opportunities, cases, and or data assets like PowerPoint presentations and sales and marketing collateral? And are there existing collaboration tools like SharePoint or Jive that we need to be mindful of? And if they are there, will they be considering a hybrid or migrate everything to Chatter? And that way they would be taking off this whole different approach to processes within the company. And this leads us to data migration, number 7. Keep in mind, most implementations will require immigration of data from legacy applications. So identify the objects that need to be migrated, the approximate number of records, and the state of the data. It is also important to identify who will be responsible for the migration, as this is an area that the customer or the custom team will probably have to take on. So since this will involve the customer, be prepared to show them your processes for migrating, cleaning, and scrubbing the data and expectations around these items. Next is integrations. The majority of implementations require integrating with an external system. So integrations can take on many forms, such as duplicating data in both systems, passing specific data between systems, or view data from an external system. And this is our last slide, number 9. Our last, but definitely not our least. So user adoption is an important and often overlooked aspect of any project. So more often than not, there are not going to be enough hours dedicated to adoption or training. And this is the first area usually that gets cut. So be sure to discuss the value of this phase early in the implementation process. Review the ideas around the power, the people, and the technology that I reviewed in a few of the other PowerPoints, as these will take precedence later on when they realize that they are not adopting the application. And you should look at the failure rates of CRM. They're very high if you don't have the proper training and adoption built into the processes. It's part of the implementation plan. I think you should just bake it in there and have it a sorted number of hours. But you have to keep those, in order to keep those hours, you have to have already gone over the value behind user adoption and training. And it is important to understand during the pre-sales cycle how the client plans to address user adoption and the areas that are going to require the focus for that user adoption, and that they understand the scope that we will be delivering. And it is critical that clients have a strategy and plan for helping the people learn and adopt the technology. So again, in the previous Salesforce.com lifecycle overview, I discussed the campaign to lead process that involves process, people, and technology. You can have the people there, but if you don't have the processes behind those people to leverage a campaign to lead to the sales teams, then it's not going to work, and they're going to be doing it the same way, and that process is going to be broken. So this area is very important, and that's why I'm spending a little more time on slide 9. And I just have a couple more notes here. The next one is understanding the client. It is best to incorporate key principles of Agile in your delivery model, including incremental and iterative delivery methods, rapid application prototyping, and early and continuous customer involvement and feedback, which is basically Agile. And one thing you want to keep in mind is that Agile is more adaptive to predictive, which is less Agile. So if you're in more of an Agile environment, you're going to have to review what Agile is to the customer. That's going to take more time and training. If you're in a more predictive environment or less Agile, then you are going to be having to deliver more documentation. So understanding your customer's mindset will allow you to appropriate the right training and time or the proper level of documentation. And usually prospective clients will fall somewhere in between the two. So just things to keep in mind. So for the implementation approach, as we discussed, do you need a workshop to train your customer on the Agile approach? If the customer is more predictive, do you need to scope in additional time for documentation? Does the customer have a change control board or other gates that will need to be worked through in order to deploy? And how involved will the customer's team be? Will you get full or near involvement? And can they expect to be minimally involved? Now, this is kind of an important thing to understand because you're going to have sign-offs for specific builds, and if you are waiting for people to review a process, then you're going to be stuck, holding the bag, and you're still going to be accountable for that. It's not going to be the customer's fault. It's going to end up mapping to you because you should have discussed that with your customer in the initial hours that you were going to have them to be able to sign off on these specific builds. So the last thing that I wanted to go over is just a few other considerations. that is territory management may add a lot of complexity and greatly increase an estimate. It's important to understand the client's needs and determine if they are truly need territory management. Also, to enable territory management, the org must be using customizable forecasting, which takes us into the whole forecasting discussion below. Quoting. While Salesforce.com has some basic quoting functionality, complex quoting is commonly done outside of Salesforce. So you might have, that's where we talk about integrations. That's where third parties come in. So additional costs as well. And Salesforce.com forecasting has a lot of limitations, so it's important to understand the client's needs and assess whether they can be met with standard forecasting functionality. A little bit I'll get into later, but you will probably need to understand the territory management versus role hierarchy. You can pause this slide and take a look at this real briefly if you need a real quick overview. But territory management is something that I'll be going over in a few other videos in the future. But overall, that's it in a nutshell. I'm right at the 11-minute mark. I wanted this to be 10 minutes. It's a very high overview, but hopefully you've pulled some value on scoping a project. And here again is what we've gone over. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. But I'll be diving into these in more detail. But this is the initial idea of how to scope a project in Salesforce. Thank you.